Michael Brown's untimely killing. And we're going to be hearing from our guests that we have with us today. We're going to get started in just 2 more minutes, but for those of you who are already on the call, you will, or on the webinar, I'm Jakade Imani. I'm with Pacific School of Religion. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to start introductions in just a moment here. For those of you who are joining the webinar as viewers, you'll be able to submit questions through the website. You should be able to see on your screen there on a box where you can actually submit questions, and my colleague here will read those questions off to us, and we'll be able to answer your questions. So we're going to get started in just one more moment here. We're going to allow people to join us. Thank you to all of our participants for being here. Angela, Kat, Diane, David, obviously. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
And Kat, is your audio good? You can hear us?
Can you hear me?
Can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Yay. I'm going to close my door.
David, would you be willing to offer another word of prayer for us as we begin this session?
Sure, you got it.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and get started again. I'm Jakade Imani with the Center for Spiritual and Social Transformation here at Pacific School of Religion. This is Theologies of Resistance. Thank you for joining us, and we're going to begin with a moment of prayer before we jump into our panel.
Welcome, everyone. My name is David Vásquez-Levy. I'm the president at Pacific School of Religion, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to engage in conversation together in this time, and we'll invite the presence of the divine God into our midst and conversation. So let us enter into an attitude of prayer. Gracious One, whose prophets have called for both hope and truth, for reality to be acknowledged while we imagine the possibility of a different reality, whose messengers have spoken of the value of every human being created in your image. We approach and gather today to remember the life and death of Michael Brown. And we ask for your spirit, as your witness in scripture says, to speak on our behalf with words too deep, or to speak on those things for which words are true, that fail us. And that your spirit may also give us the courage to speak of the hope that is within us. A hope that is rooted in truth telling, a hope that is rooted in a call for justice, not in the absence of truth telling, not in the absence of reality, so that it may be lasting. We pray especially as we gather for those most directly affected by Michael's death and the death of so many others, that they may know your love and care expressed by the communities who surround them, and that we may be called by their loss to speak words of courage, words of justice. In your many gracious names we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, David. So I want to introduce a few of our, I want to introduce all of our panelists. Kat, is there a way that you can move your camera back a little so we get a little more light? Oh, there we go, a little light on your face. Yeah, so I want to introduce my sister, Kat Brooks, who's with Oakland Black Power Network and the Onyx Organizing Committee. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Kat.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. And Reverend Diane Weible, who's the conference minister for Northern California Nevada Conference of the United Church of Christ. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
This afternoon, I should say. And then Reverend Angela Brown, who's associate pastor at Glide. Oh, did we lose her? Or is she still there? Oh, we'll give her a second to sign back on. You know, technological difficulties. It's 2015, and we have the internet in our pocket, but it ain't always with us. But God is on our side for sure. And then our president and my fearless leader, David Vásquez-Levy, the good reverend.
Thank you for that opportunity to be together.
Yes. So, you know, I want to just jump into the conversation. Folks will be able to pose questions, but, you know, 1 year later, as this anniversary comes around, this painful commemoration comes around, how are each of you making meaning of this? You know, maybe we'll start with you, Kat, as somebody who's been on the streets in these issues, organizing around Black Lives Matter before that was a hashtag, a catchphrase, or a movement. How are you making sense of this year, and what are you thinking or hoping that faith communities could take away from or take into this next year of struggle?
Right. So it's a two-part question, right? So in terms of making sense of this year, I don't know that any of us have made sense of this year. I feel like many of us have sort of held on to the momentum of this year as best we can, especially in the light of the fact that we have seen police pushing back on this movement with increased violence. People ask me, are they really killing more of us, or do we just hear about it more? They are killing more of us, right? When you challenge a bully, the bully pushes back, and there have been multiple deaths. We went from 1 every 28 hours in 2014 to in 2015, we're up to 1 every 8 or 9 hours. So a Black man, woman, or child is murdered by law enforcement, security guards, or vigilantes. So we are definitely in the midst of a very intense struggle. And in the light of all of that trauma, though, we've seen an explosion of new, young, and not always young people, but new, young Black activists and organizers on the scene, and a rejection of respectability politics, a rejection of compromise, and a demand that the war on Black lives comes to an end. So coming up on this anniversary, we'll commemorate it here in Oakland with a vigil and probably a march. And then I know Black Lives Matter Bay Area is going to have a Black folks dinner where people can just break bread and share space. But really looking at what the next year entails, and the next year entails reaching those we have not yet been able to reach, which I think is a good segue into what faith leaders can do. Mm-hmm. And the conversations that I've had with pastors, progressive Black pastors in particular, getting their congregations involved in what's happening in the streets is a difficult task, right? Because when you turn on the news, what you see is Black people fighting with the police. And in the Bay Area in particular, then you see the aftermath of that, which are often property damage. And so how do we have this conversation in a spiritual way, acknowledging the righteous rage of the young people that are in the streets and the realities of folks, right, that who may not choose that as a tactic? Mm-hmm. And what I'm urging us to do is push the conversation beyond police terror. The war on Black lives is not just happening through police terror. The war on Black lives is happening economically through gentrification and job access or lack thereof. It is happening educationally with over 50% of our young people not graduating from high schools. And it's happening mentally, emotionally, and mentally and emotionally and spiritually as the trauma of being Black in this country wears us down, and then you see the results of that in all kinds of things, from self-loathing all the way up to intercommunal violence. And so those are the things that I'm encouraging faith leaders to bring into their congregations and have conversations around. What committees can you form in your churches that can tackle those issues in a self-determined way, as opposed to waiting on institutions from the state to come handle things that they're never going to handle, right? And certainly are not handling adequately.
Wow, thank you for that. Reverend Weible, can we turn to you? Your my understanding is from the St. Louis area. You're here now, based in California and representing California and the Nevada area, but you're actually from a region of the country. How are you, making meaning of this period, and how are you helping the people in your faith community understand it?
I grew up in St. Louis. I've been away from there for a long time, but when Michael Brown was murdered last summer, the first thing that came to my mind was, I'm not surprised. The St. Louis area as I know it, as I grew up in it was very segregated. I came from South County, which is predominantly white, and in my case, the area where I grew up in was very wealthy. And I was taught by society, by family, by friends to fear anything north of Clayton and east of my grandma's house, which would have been downtown St. Louis and East St. Louis. And, I grew up thinking that I was always on the side of racial justice, and that I was going to, whenever my grandfather would make comments, I would get so mad at him, and I would just, I would just get so mad at him. And my grandma would say, she used to ask my grandpa why he did it when he knew how upset I got. And he just laughed and said, it's because I like to see her get mad. So I always thought that I was, I had grown up and known a different reality. And it wasn't until I was dating my husband, and we were going to visit his grandparents in Belleville, Illinois. And he drove through East St. Louis to get there. And the very first time that he did it, I said to him, no, you can't go through East St. Louis. We're going to die. And he said, what are you talking about? It's the fastest way. We're going to drive through East St. Louis. And it was at that time and the times after that we would drive through there to go visit his grandparents that I realized that everything that I have been taught to fear was not because of that area was an area to be feared and to be stayed away from. It was because of the poverty and the things that community was facing that I never ever experienced in my own community. And so it opened my eyes to realize what was it about living in the community I was raised in that allowed me all the privilege and advantage that people in this community didn't have. And it was then that I realized it wasn't just a matter of saying, well, I'm going to fight for racial justice. It was recognizing that I had been given opportunities that others had not. And when Michael Brown was killed last summer, I was listening to a news report, and someone was commenting on the fact that African-American families, from the time that their children are young, they're teaching them how to stay alive in the presence of police and how to be able to live in communities where they're not treated fairly. And the anchor, I remember the white anchor, she was looking at her counterpart, the other anchor, an African-American, and she said, is that true? Did you have to teach your children that? And he said, well, of course, we all do. And the look on her face was also the look on my face, because it never would have dawned on me that there are families that have to have those conversations. So all of this has really, over the past year, made me wrestle with coming to understand. And I always knew this in my gut, but I know it now in a way that compels me to try to find solutions. And that is that it's not enough to stop the violence that's happening in Ferguson or in other areas. You need the communities in South County and West County, the predominantly white communities, to recognize that they've been granted privileges and they've been given opportunities that others are not given. And the only reason they've been given them is because of the color of their skin. And to recognize that until they step up and say, this isn't right, then there's no way that in my opinion, that we can ever make any changes. And I was having lunch at our denomination's General Synod, which we just had last month. And I was having lunch with two women from Christ the King Church in Florissant, Missouri. And one of them was telling me that she has a friend who lives in South County or in another part of St. Louis that will see job postings for jobs that earn really good wages, and you only need a high school diploma. And she said that she would see these job postings and she would call her friend who lived in Florissant and say, hey, I've got, found this great job posting. Those jobs were not being posted in Florissant. They were only being posted in the white communities. And so, to understand that kind of, I don't even know what the right word it is, but for people to really start to understand what they've been given is the only way that we're going to make changes.
Thank you. Yeah, it really speaks to the insidiousness of white supremacy and racism, is even people who oppose it have these notions embedded in our psyche. President Vásquez-Levy, how are you reflecting and making meaning?
Yeah, I appreciate both Kat's and Diane's comments about the first step is to realize the systemic nature of what we're dealing with. That while we pause this week to remember one individual's life, that we recognize his death came about as part of a much larger system. That we cannot get distracted by the individual actions that often get associated with Michael Brown, almost as if they could excuse the situation. That the important thing here is to recognize the systemic issues that both Kat and Diane have spoken to. And the second thing is just the persistent nature of this. Diane talked about dealing with this as a child in her own family. I think each of us could share lessons of both comments and ways in which the discussions about race were shaped. I think we're getting some feedback. I'll stop a little bit to see if we can figure out what's going on.
There we go.
Okay. All right. So the systemic, and then the fact that these are long-term issues. And so the way I've been living with it, on the one hand, is recognizing that systemic reality. We have just looked for a home here in the Bay Area as we moved here about 6 months ago to serve at PSR with my family. The realities I know about segregation, gentrification, division of neighborhoods hit us hard as we were looking at homes. Just how unequal, how not just who ends up living in homes, but who even gets to look at homes can be racially divided. And in the East Bay, I'm coming from a very divided community ethnically in the Midwest, know the diversity of the Bay Area, and yet encountering that which we know firsthand has been difficult. So again, it speaks to the systemic nature. And it's particularly touched me both because it's a systemic issue I have a commitment to, but my family is an interracial family, and so it's difficult to find room for my family in a neighborhood where we can fit in, you know, because most neighborhoods need to be either the places where I fit in as a Latino, where my wife fits in as a white person, or where my children fit in as Black children. And so where is the neighborhood where we all fit in? Where is the church where we all fit in? So that's where the challenges have been for me. How do we name these systemic issues? How do we retain the strength, the courage to tend to this year over year and over time because of the commitment we have? The coping with it comes from me, from my own faith, and our work here at PSR expresses that faith in committing to preparing leaders who first are theologically rooted, who understand issues as being systemic, and who are spiritually rooted, who know that we require the need for all of us to have this kind of conversation, to create this kind of space within our faith communities, to speak with hopefulness, to speak with courage and with truth to these realities.
Thank you. Angela, we're going to come to you. We're asking folks initially to reflect on how they're making meaning of this 1 year since Michael Brown's killing. For all of those who are viewing this webinar, in a few moments we're going to get to your questions. So please feel free to type in your questions, and we'll get them to our panelists. But Angela, you next. Reverend Brown, how are you making meaning at Glide and with the folks in the faith communities you work with of this particular moment of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Trying to keep it on the front burner for people, that once the media leaves, we should not leave the topic, because it is a topic that still has to be dealt with. Over decades, we've always, an incident will pop up and then we'll be all hot and fired up and ready to go, and then the media goes away, and so does the interest. Prior to seminary, I was an assistant DA in San Francisco, and so I saw the injustices in the criminal justice system. For instance, the sentencing policy on crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. The difference being who uses powder cocaine versus who uses crack cocaine. The sentences for crack cocaine, being a predominant drug in the African American community, had higher sentencing, whereas powder drug used by Europeans usually had lighter sentences, offer of diversion. So just those type of disparities. And I just think that we can no longer afford not to keep this on the front burner because it has invaded all of our systems, our churches, our criminal justice system, housing. It just is permeated our entire lives, and we can no longer just run from one incident to the other, but make sure that it is constantly on our radar, and especially people who have a strong drive towards justice. And, you know, I would call our European brothers and sisters to talk to their other European brothers and sisters and make them aware of the white privilege that they have been able to take advantage of all their lives. And you know, when you're seated in the back of a restaurant by the kitchen, if you're European, you don't have to wonder, well, is it because I'm European? But as an African American, that is always something on the forefront. Am I being treated this way because of who I am?
Thank you so much. So, David, how you know, I know you've pastored a church, and we will have some. I did an interview earlier, late last week, with Professor Sharon Fenema, our Director of Worship Life and Assistant Professor of Worship here, and that's up on the website. But David, if you were pastoring a church, and you might actually get to, you know, probably will get invited to come and speak one of these upcoming Sundays over the next month, you know, what worship resources would you bring to bear? What would you be thinking about? What might you be pulling from Scripture, or what stories might you be sharing from your experience?
Yeah, I think, you know, I commend the conversation with Professor Fenema here at PSR, who offers some really great ideas about ways to bring the conversation live and center, as Angela has indicated, into the worship life, to just realize a couple of things that are part of our rituals in worship. Many communities begin, or at some point in the service, will have a time of confession. That can be a time where we just sort of rattle something off, you know, without thinking through it. Can we take some time to confess privilege, to confess inequality, to look around the space and say, we confess that this place looks very homogeneous? I mean, can we have the courage to really use that ritual in that way? We have rituals of remembrance. This is a week of remembrance. We have rituals by which we remember those who have died. We do so in hope. So can we draw on those rituals from our communities to use them as part of our worship experience on Sunday? When we first moved here to the Bay Area, we were driving by a school, and on the window of the school was a big sign that said Black Lives Matter. My daughter looked at that and just was struck by it, because all of a sudden she realized the school she's been attending back in Iowa, even while all of this has been going on, would never have put up a sign that says Black Lives Matter on it. It just wasn't talked about because it was a predominantly white community. So it matters. So if our silence will speak loudly. So if in worship this Sunday we don't acknowledge this in some way, I think we'll be missing an opportunity and we'll be communicating something. The readings for the Sunday, many folks follow the lectionary. I just want to highlight a couple of brief things for if you do follow the common lectionary, to consider some ways of using that real briefly here that I'll mention. But many other texts certainly can speak to this. In part, the piece I'll say broadly about the text is that the biblical stories provide an incredible range of emotions that can accommodate the kind of emotions this experience, this loss, this reality is bringing up for all of us, from grief to anger to sorrow. So just to take the readings as one way to think about it for the lectionary for this Sunday, they run that whole range. You know, we can begin, for example, with the Hebrew Bible text for this Sunday, which is drawn from 2 Samuel 18. It's the story of the death of Absalom, who was King David's son. It's a very complex story. I just want to highlight one phrase in there. Absalom is in a battle and he gets caught on a tree, and he hangs literally between heaven and earth. That's what the phrase says. It says specifically, that it says he was left hanging between heaven and earth. That's, the story highlights two important things. One is the complexity of what leads to Absalom's death. It is not a single person's death. There is a history of inequality, of division. There's a very complex story behind it that we can take some time to unpack and realize an individual's death is systemic, is a part of something larger. And then this image of his body being left there initially, the desecration of a body, the lack of respect for a body. Michael Brown's body sat on the ground, unattended, for an inexplicable period of time. It communicates something very significant. And we must deconstruct that, understand that, challenge that, and then be called by that, not only how we deal with the dead bodies of those whose lives have been lost, whether it has been in war, in conflict, in the conflicts in our own streets, but how do we live and deal with the living bodies of those who are around us, and how we respect our very bodies, which we call the temples of the Holy Spirit. A couple of other texts for this Sunday. Psalm 130 is just incredibly powerful. Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord. Hear my voice. And then it goes on in verse 6. I wait for the Lord, more than a watchman for the morning, to recognize our brothers and sisters in the African American community have been waiting for a long time on the Lord for justice to come about. We need the dawn of a new day, and we are called to do that. We cannot pretend and just invite for more patience. So the text can challenge us in that way, invite us in that way, give us that promise. And finally, the gospel reading for Sunday is from John 6. The phrase that stuck out to me in that text that can be a place of reflection. Jesus says, I should lose nothing of all that he has given me. Every single one that has been given to God, that God has given life to, is precious in God's eyes. To speak that commitment that every life matters.
Kat, can we go for you for a second? There's been a lot of conversation about, sometimes when Black Lives Matter is said, people want to say all lives matter. And there's been pushback on that, particularly from the folks who are on the front lines dealing with this, about why that is so offensive. Can you share with folks your view on why that might be so offensive to Black people who are losing their lives on the streets of this nation? Why this notion that all lives matter?
It's problematic. And not the concept that all lives matter. It's not that, because of course all lives do matter, right? And no one is saying that they don't, and we work in solidarity with our brown brothers and sisters and Asian brothers and sisters. But the fact that it is so difficult, that the disease of white supremacy has infected us so deeply, which is on, right, a white supremacy, Black oppression paradigm, that disease has infected us so deeply that many of us are not comfortable in spaces where we are upholding the sanctity of Black life. That has to be covered up or included with something else, or another conversation has to happen on top of it. And then the other piece I feel that comes up is the oppression Olympics, right? Because white supremacy targets a bunch of folks. And so the way that some of us have learned to deal with that is to, well, I'm the most oppressed. No, I'm the most oppressed. Well, I'm the most oppressed. And none of that gets us to the real meaning of solidarity, right? And so the response is usually, yes, all lives matter. We're clear about that. But we're just going to take a little moment and talk about the Black ones right now, if that's all right with you, right? Because clearly our schools and our courts and the police haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important. And it's important to think and to see that clearly in this moment, because I think there's a real moment of not just potential solidarity, of real deep solidarity.
We're seeing amazing things, right? In the Bay Area, we've got Asians for Black Lives, who have been there on the front lines for us, who shut down the federal building for several hours. Rasa for Black Lives, who are holding their own actions. And then we've seen white allies step up in ways that at least I in the Bay Area have never seen before. It's usually been sort of this constant fight around what tactics or strategies were acceptable in fighting for Black life. And we've got two amazing groups of white allies that are really taking leadership from Black folks as they too demand the end of the war on Black lives. So I think that as much controversy as that's created, it's also created some amazing strands of solidarity and in the likes that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, thank you. We want to go to some of the questions that folks have posted online. Leslie, can you read those out for us, or are you going to handle that? Yeah.
Thanks, Jakota. Sure. I'm going to unmute. So the first, oops, you muted. Okay, is that better? No. Got it. So one of the first questions, does anyone have any advice on resources or on how to talk to children, especially white children, about what happened to Mike Brown and about the Black Lives Matter movement? I'm a newly hired Black pastor of a white church, and I've heard from many parents that they just don't know what to say to their children about these events without upsetting them. I'm wondering if any of you have any advice on incorporating children into this conversation.
That's a great question. That's any takers for that first go around?
I don't know how you have the conversation without upsetting your child. Jay, you know, my daughter is deeply ingrained in the movement. She hits the streets with us on a regular basis. And for me, my choice as a parent, my daughter's 9 now, and she's been immersed since 2009 when Oscar was murdered and she was 3. But I've found it as a parent my duty for her to understand what she's walking into. But unlike me, who grew up very much knowing that I was Black and knowing that I was being treated different ways because I was Black, but feeling I had no outlet to deal with that, literally staying up all night, tossing and turning about things like this, I feel like for my child to be immersed the way that she's immersed, she feels like she is an outlet. She has power, the power of resistance, right? And so she very much doesn't see herself as a victim. She sees herself as a warrior in her little 9-year-old space and self, right? And I think that's important. I think honesty with our children is important. And talking about white privilege with young white kids now, I think is critical and crucial. And you don't have to go into the gory details about what happened, but finding the right words to break down white supremacy and the way that it infects our society, I think it's critical that we have those conversations sooner than later. And we don't sugarcoat it, because once they leave you and they're on their school campus, trust me, those babies aren't sugarcoating anything.
Yeah, and I would, if I could step in a bit into that too, I appreciate that very much, Kat. My daughter's also 9, just about to be, similarly has been very involved herself in a number of opportunities to feel an agency. So the first thing I think is what gives your congregational children, your kids in your community, a sense of agency about this. Protecting them from it by not sharing the reality of it creates a divide for children. I know my kids have experienced it, but they're Black, but I also know their cousins who are white have experienced it in their own communities, where the fact that they know it's in the news, it's out there, people are talking about it. But if there's silence about it in their church, silence about it in their homes, then there's a disconnect, because they think either this doesn't matter to my church or my family, or they think there's nothing that can be done. The reality is, without sugarcoating, we do need to speak to it. So one way we have done that, just on a very kind of pragmatic way, possibility is, if you take the book, for example, or part of the movie of Horton, Here's a Who, you know, to emphasize in that story, the line of the story is, you know, a person's a person no matter how small. That's sort of the tagline of that book and the story. So to look at that story as an introduction to it, you know, to be able to say, here's an elephant who's taking on the task of protecting others, and who others don't see that reality. You know, you're trying to protect or to raise something that others aren't talking about or constantly deny. So that gives them a bit of a sense of agency, a sense of the importance of the conversation, and a way to think about that. So that could be one way of bringing that into a conversation in the congregational setting. You know, I think the risk is always going to be to then make it very broad about just everything, and we got to love everybody and be just to everybody. We also need to move to the specificity, you know, being able to name, this is one particular moment where that's needed.
Can I just throw in something as a parent of white children? who are older. And, you know, my kids would often, we'd have conversations at the dinner table where they would say, everyone loves everyone, and, you know, everyone is equal, and we're all, you know, and they would talk about their friends, and I said, but we're not. You have to understand where your privileges and what you have that others don't. And until you do that, it's not enough to say that we're all equal in God's eyes. We're all, you know, we need to recognize where for them, I said, you need to recognize where you've been given advantages that others haven't. And when I started to share specifically what some of those advantages are, it really turned the conversation, because they had never thought about that before.
Reverend Angela, we got a question about how do you share that from a pastor, an African-American pastor in a predominantly white church, resources for children, and helping to have this conversation for children in a way that is empowering and transformative. And we've had some great responses. If you have any thoughts that you'd like to share on that question, we also have a few other questions.
No more than what's already been said. I think it is a conversation that needs to be held by parents and the church, and to do it in a way that's age appropriate. As Kat said, you don't have to go into the gory details, but just letting them know that there are differences in the way people are being treated, and that they can start by treating everyone that they encounter in their circle equally. But do notice that when people are being treated unfairly, and speak up about that, and notice who is doing, you know, the harassing or being unfair, and just ask them why. And again, for white children to know the advantages that they are given just by the virtue of that they're white, and that they have a responsibility because of those privileges to stand in the gap for those that are being treated unfairly.
Thank you. Leslie, are there other questions?
Yes, there's lots.
Next time I'll ask after I turn it off.
Mute. This is more of a quick one. We have a question. Can you please say a little bit more about addressing respectability politics in our faith communities?
Kat, are you still there?
Hold on.
Can you see me? Hi.
You did.
So I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we're good? Okay. I think, and I don't mean to simplify it, because I know it's difficult, or I know it's complicated and not difficult, but part of what that means is you have to pick a side, right? There's no more sort of standing in the middle of an issue. If it's right, it's right. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And we're going to, which side are you on? And we're going to stand on the side of righteousness, no matter what that costs us, right? No matter how difficult it might be for your future relationship with the mayor. If she enacts a curfew on Black protests, then you need to stand up and say something about that. Regardless of, this might be the biggest donor in your church, right? If they are tied to something where a Black or brown person has been murdered or killed or beaten, you've got to stand up and say something about that. And so respectability politics is really about not fearing the consequences for being righteous. And I think that pastors and faith leaders sit in an excellent place to be great role models for that behavior, right? To be fearless in the face of injustice, as Jesus was.
Yeah. I often think of Reverend King's quote about being maladjusted, right? His speech about we can be adjusted and accommodating to injustice, and that's not when we're doing our job. And so, yeah, I think there is this push, and we see it in lots of different movements and communities, this push to be as presentable, as assimilated, that it's the most sort of white sounding, most sort of middle class aspiring folks who get to be the face of and the voice of and the demands of the movement, as opposed to what the masses of people really want and crave, right?
And then we want to push those masses, right? We want to push Pookie and them to the back, right? We don't want them to be our voice or our face because what other people think. But the reality is that those are the folks that are feeling the boot of white supremacy most violently. And those are the folks that we need to lift up and hold for their voices to be heard.
No, I think that's absolutely right, which has been one of the most, for me, inspiring parts of this movement has been seeing the voices of women, of Black women, of Black trans women, made room for in a profound and transformative way, for the voices of our move, for these movements to be similarly on questions of gender identity and immigration, for it to be women of color standing up and being pushed into the forefront, or not even pushed, allowed space to really use their voice has been tremendous and amazing.
I just want to add to that, it has been said for evil to exist is for good people to do nothing. And so we can no longer afford to do nothing because that gives license to evilness to just permeate all our lives more and more. So good people can no longer be on the sidelines.
Indeed, indeed. I'm looking to Leslie for more questions, but I'm going to mute now.
That was well timed. Great. So a number of the questions ask things like, as people of faith, what should our role be in promoting the legal and political and judicial reform that must take place if these killings are to stop? It seems that marching is not enough. And there's also a question here about where are the trainings, where to get education, especially for folks in the UCC, and I know Diane has a good answer to that. What's next? What actions can we take?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just learn a little bit about some of the UCC resources, because I know that in Northern California, Nevada, in our conference, we are looking at how to further those conversations, sacred conversations on white privilege. And I know even some of our local churches are doing that. I'm actually going to a church on Friday night that is doing a series of sacred conversations on race. And in particular, they're talking about white privilege. So I think there is a movement within our churches to, let's talk about this and let's be real about it and start to really understand what this means and what our role is in making something different. And I know, Angela, you talked about making those, having those conversations and not backing away from them and being really honest about it. I know on a denominational level, there have been conversations that have been going on for the past year, telephone conversations among our denominational leaders and pulling together some resources. We have some worship resources for this Sunday, which has been deemed a Racial Justice Sunday, and to remember Michael Brown. And so there are some resources. We'll be getting links out on that that people can use in worship. David talked about, even using some of those memorial rituals. For me as a visual person, one of the best things would be to have a candle that's lit in memory of Mike Brown in every church across the country, around the world if we can, to really remember that this is a life that did not need to end the way it did and when it did.
And I just want to say the United Methodist Church has devised 4 different small group discussions that can be held by congregations. The first session is Recognize Our Brokenness, to talk honestly about how we are broken as a beloved community. And the second is to love our neighbors. And what they suggest happens there is that name tags be made of each of the individuals who have been killed, say, in the last 18 months. And for the person that's wearing that name tag to speak as if they were that person, talk about who that person was before they were killed, because that humanizes the person. Because for some of us in our congregations, all we know is a name. But to take the time to find out who that person was humanizes that person, so we can see what a loss that person's taking that person's life has been a loss to all of us. And to welcome all people. What does diversity, true diversity, look like? And when we talk about inclusiveness, what do we really mean about that? How do we really make that happen and not just, use it as a catchphrase? And then the last one is, how do we build the beloved community? And that's based on Isaiah 58, 1-2. What does it really mean to free the oppressed? And I think, Chakada, that get into what we're talking about, what kind of political action should we take? What type of discussion should we have with our legislators when they come in our neighborhood and want our vote? Let's hold them accountable. Let's tell them what we need for our communities to be a beloved community and to make sure that we hold them accountable once they get our support. So that's something that the United Methodist Church is encouraging all churches to do. And we have resources through our Commission on Religion and Race. We have our Book of Resolutions. So there are resources in the United Methodist Church to help churches have those type of discussions.
Yeah. On our website at ignitepsr.org, you can sign up there and find out more about our work. We also have a workshop that we provide to congregations and communities to help them go deeper into this work of beginning to talk about race in very honest and hopefully transformative ways. Reverend Angela, that piece of Isaiah goes on to talk about when we set the captive free, that those folks who've been left out and left behind will be called the pillars of the Lord. So the very people who are left out in that scripture goes on to say that those are the people who actually restore the community. The incarcerated, the locked out, and the left behind are the actual restorers of God's kingdom. So that's such a powerful piece. I'm gonna see if there's
just a quick word. The question was raised around in the framework on the image of next steps, which invites a movement. Certainly, the call to discipleship. If you look within the Christian tradition, when Jesus comes, the invitation is come and see. So I think that's the invitation of discipleship in this conversation. Come and see, take a look and learn. We were talking about the politics of respectability. Engage that conversation with Shifra and Pua, the midwives who resisted the orders of Pharaoh, to eliminate the children. Have that conversation with Miriam, Moses' sister, who also kind of gets involved to change the course of the expectation of these children who are considered disposable in the community. So those, I think, come and see is the place. So in the scriptures, come and see. We have a group of students right now traveling for a course in Ferguson. They started here learning from the community about the work being done, and we'll travel also this week to Ferguson to mark this anniversary. We may not all be able to do that, but we don't have to go very far to find those pilgrimage places where our communities acknowledge, embody, and see the price we are paying for the inequality and the injustice and the white supremacy. It may be a jail in our neighborhood. It may be the court system. Go sit in the court one day and see who's being tried and what the decisions are. So really come and see. I mean, we can't expect to just sit in our congregation, in our communities, especially because they are so segregated, and understand this conversation fully if we don't take those steps and go into our communities to do that. Visit the schools in your neighborhood and beyond your neighborhood to see what's happening. Talk to them about what kind of issues they're facing. And participate in the opportunities that are being offered around your community, because they are happening. They're happening all over the place. And if they're not, you can organize them.
That's all very true. Thank you. We're gonna hear from Leslie for a few more questions.
One of the panelists, one of the participants here asks, how can those in business be better allies and advocates for faith communities, for inclusion, calling out and acting on white privilege, and being stronger supporters of the movement?
That's a great question. How can business be a better ally in dealing with these issues of white supremacy? Kat, do you want to take a first run at this one?
There we go. Can you hear me? Okay, great.
Yes,
Sure. I thought at first to ask how businesses can be allies to faith communities, but I think even reversing the practices, I mean, it's the bare bones stuff, right? Like, who can you hire? Who can you train to hire? Where are you placing your business? Where are you giving percentages of profits to? Resources, right? Most of us that are doing this work, we are not paid to do this work, right? There's not a huge fundraising mechanism in the Black Lives Matter movement. What else? Pushing back, I'm talking about specifically in the Bay Area, there is a narrative that business will not come here or cannot flourish here because we are protest here. We need business leaders to stand up and say that's actually not true, right? And we want to put our businesses inside of communities that are grounded in racial and social justice and equity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, indeed. Reverend Weible, is there any way you're thinking about this and how you all are partnering with the business community?
Well, I'm thinking back to what I heard from that member of Christ the King Church, and when she said that businesses are advertising for jobs in one particular community and not advertising that all around, and for more people to recognize that that's wrong and to call out other businesses on that and try to make changes that way, even little things that they see in communities that are happening, and calling those other businesses accountable for it.
Indeed.
I think one piece real quick is that whether it's our congregations, our businesses, our other organizations, bringing the conversation up in the circles we're in takes courage. So if you're part of some kind of association of businesses, to just raise the question and say, how are we practicing some kind of action that seeks to provide equal access, naming the fact that there isn't equal access. It isn't enough just to post a job description and expect people to come. What's the language of our posting look like? Is it biased in certain ways against the educational level, opportunities, and community makeup that we're in? Where do we post? And just to understand that color blindness is a way of retaining the status quo. We need to realize that the society is not colorblind, and because of that, we need to make more of an intentional effort to change the opportunity and the access.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One of our partners who runs a cafe in Oakland talked about how a lot of the candidates who he ended up interviewing looked an awful lot like him, even as he was just receiving emails from them. And he started realizing that he was weeding out certain people based on how they wrote their email. Just, and the position had nothing to do with writing, but his sort of own, like, people who frame sentences in certain ways, or their sentences weren't sloppy, or their punctuation was off. He wouldn't even give them an interview. And he started realizing that was a bias that he didn't realize he had as a good, solid, progressive person.
And I think one final thing on that is that I'm really glad the questions come up, from somebody who has some work within the business community. Without the business community, this will not happen. And belying that contrast between the fact that the movement, its protests are a loss to business, needs to be countered. Also, what are the ways in which business can help create opportunities for minority-owned businesses, African-American-owned businesses? Where are the places where we can put some resources to create those opportunities, because there's still huge limitations of access to lending, to credit, to just basic knowledge. We have a lot of folks who have great, incredible business experience. Can they seek to mentor others in their community, young adults who are beginning to think about this, give them opportunities to learn and to grow?
I'd like to add just one more quick thing. I have not read the interview, so it's probably not even right for me to say this, but I did hear a quote last night on the newscast from the interview that was done with Darren Wilson. And the quote that I heard, and assuming this is correct, is that he said he was talking about people who come from a different culture than the right culture. And I was so angry and so offended when I heard that. And I thought to myself, you know, there is no right culture. And to assume that everyone is going to do things exactly the way I do it, and if they don't, it's wrong. That is a way of thinking and a mindset that we have to change. And to realize that there are different cultures, different ways of doing things, and that needs to be celebrated and embraced. And we need to learn from those different cultures rather than assume that they're wrong and we're right.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna let Leslie give us one last question, and then let you do some wrap-up thoughts. And
I think this riffs on some of the things that we've already spoken about, but we have one question from a participant that says, I have a biracial son who's 16 who has mostly white friends, but when I try to talk about race with him, he refuses to get connected and considers this the issue of the older generation. And they ask, how do I get them interested in this conversation?
Well, that's a deep one right there.
Anybody want to take the first one with that?
I mean, I can speak a little. Sorry, got dragged. Hey, I'll just be brief. But as I mentioned, my son is now 13, African American, in a biracial family. There's definitely a burden on children to figure out ways to engage the conversation and ways in which, like any person of color in the United States, you hit a limit and you feel like I can't keep talking about this. You know, I just and the reality is we have to. You know, so part of it is creating and acknowledging the fact of that there's some unfairness in the way that some folks have to have this conversation while others can choose to opt out and to sort of just be very transparent about saying this is. And then again, earlier on in the conversation, we talked about a sense of agency to kind of really feel. I think, Kat, you mentioned that you know, that are there ways that we can help our children feel like they can enter into the conversation with agency, and to say there are some generational differences, and what they point to is that the realities remain of inequality, but some of the changes is that there are opportunities we have today to speak that we may not have had before. Through the social media we have access to, through the partnerships. If, you know, many of his friends are white, he has a possibility there to create a community of resistance in some ways. And so to find those resources, those ways to help first acknowledge the challenge of this, the unfairness of it, to emphasize the fact that it's important, not just for himself, but for what he can contribute in the world, and to find ways for him to feel a sense of agency.
Yeah, that's very important. I mean, I think my children also are younger, 13, 15 years old, and think about these issues in some ways differently. Growing up in a more multiracial society, and still having those conversations about how others perceive them and how rapidly that can change. Sandra Bland, by all accounts, was a middle-class Black woman on her way to her new middle-class job in Texas, when all of that changed quite rapidly. And so I think, and some of that is, I think, David, you put it quite rightly, is the unjustness of white supremacy, is that some people have to have these conversations even we don't want to. And the persistence of white supremacy means that we can have great affluence and achieve greatness, individual distinction. And President Obama said, if the Secret Service caught him wandering on the grounds in a dark alley in his sweatsuit, he might get shot by the people who would protect him, because Blackness means something in our society that transcends, you know, our faculties about right and wrong, and that's indoctrinated into all of us to some extent. I want to pause here and give you all a final word, a final thought that you would like to leave folks with, as you know, yeah, a final thought that each of you might want to leave our viewers with today. And maybe we'll start with you, Angela, and end with you, David. Angela,
Yeah, your mic is not on.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Read part of the Franciscan blessing that says, "May God bless you with discomfort and easy answers and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. May God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. And may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be upon you and remain with you forever. Amen."
Thank you. Kat? Are you on mute there, Kat? Maybe we'll go to...
The mute is on the bottom left.
Ah, I see it. I have control of that. Okay. Just very briefly, I think the thought that I want to leave with folks is that everybody has a role to play, right? And all roles, it's all roads in right now. All roles are important. So your role or the role of your congregation may not be in the streets, getting it in with the police. It may be the pulpit. It may be meeting with legislators. It may be childcare, right? But figure out where your gifts, your talent, and your passions lie. And don't use your fear of what's happening out there as your rationale for not getting engaged, because the time is right now. And the demand is to pick a side and put in the work.
Thank you. And Reverend Weible?
I think for me, that final word would be a call and a request for all of our congregations, especially our congregations that are predominantly white, to have the conversation and to let down the defensiveness that automatically wants to come up and be honest about what it is that we've received that others haven't, and really start to recognize what other people are living through that we've never even had a clue about.
David?
First, a word of thanks to all of you who have been part of the conversation here, offering your reflections, those who offered their questions, and the ones we were able to get to. I know there's others out there as well. A word of thanks for the fact that people are engaging the conversation here right now today, and the hopefulness that you will engage that on Sunday in worship in your communities or through the week and at work and your business and other places. A deep, deep word of thanks for that because of the importance of it. And then a challenge to live out for those of us who make sense of the world, make meaning of the world through the Christian story. It's at its core incarnational. The idea that this large systemic God became a human being, one human being, extremely vulnerable, who was the victim of, in the end, state-sponsored violence and died. That we find a way in this conversation out of our faith to remain both aware of the systemic reality and to acknowledge that, and yet deeply rooted in Michael Brown's body, life, death, his family, that of Tamir Rice, that of that child on Saturday, this past week in Cleveland, who was surrounded by police in the middle of protests. All of these are individuals. And so how do we draw on our traditions to remember that dichotomy, that contrast, to hold those in tension, the systemic realities yet embodied in individuals and whose lives matter.
Thank you. So at the end of this webinar, you're going to get an email where you can share this with your friends, post it on Facebook, continue the conversation going. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. We have our next webinar coming up October 6th, 1 p.m. It's going to be on immigration and nationalism and new narratives about immigration, a way to understand it and make meaning of it. David's going to have a lot to say about that, as well as a few other folks. and sign up at psr.edu or ignitepsr.org to find out more. We appreciate your support and your commitment, everything you're doing in your community. May the Spirit bless and keep you. Be well. Thank you all. Bye.